The chipped formica of the steering wheel felt cold under my palms, even through the seat warmer. I'd been gripping it too tight. I realized, knuckles white, just thinking about the bills. Another one had come today, a past due notice from the hospital, and it felt like they were sending them on purpose, timed to coincide with my commute. Like they knew I was trying to just get to work. The neighborhood wasn't much to look at, all low, flat buildings and cracked pavement. More warehouses than anything, really. And this dispatch center, National Forwarding, looked like it had been built in the 1970s and forgotten about. A long, low brick building, mostly dark windows, with a single flickering fluorescent light above the entrance. The parking lot was mostly empty, a scattering of semi-trucks and a couple of beat-up cars. I circled once, finding a spot near the back, trying not to think about how much a new set of tires would cost. The inside smelled like stale coffee and something else, a sort of metallic dryness. Not blood exactly, but something that made the back of my throat feel tight. The reception area was small, a worn vinyl couch against one wall and a desk with a thick partition. A woman with a severe bun and glasses perched on the end of her nose, Una, her name tag read, barely glanced up when I walked in. She handed me a stack of forms already half filled out and a laminated employee handbook. Sign here, here, and initial all the boxes. HR will be by later for the full onboarding. And here's the supplement. She slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, stapled to the bottom of the paperwork. It didn't even have a page number. The dispatch room itself was bigger than I expected. Rows of cubicles, each with a phone, a computer, and a map plastered on the wall. The glow of the monitors cast a pale light over everything. It was quiet, mostly the hum of the computers and the occasional crackle of a radio. The air felt still. Not temperature-wise, it wasn't cold, but like the air itself was holding its breath. I found my assigned cubicle, number 7, and started going through the paperwork. The usual stuff, emergency contacts, tax information, benefits enrollment. Then I got to the last page. It was typed, a slightly different font than the rest of the documents, and the paper was a heavier weight. A list. Rules. 1. Whoever leaves last must perform the following before exiting. Check every light switch. Do not leave without completing it. I frowned. Check every light switch? What was that about? Probably some energy-saving initiative or a weird security thing. Old buildings always have quirks. 2. At the start of each week, read the previous week's maintenance log before beginning your shift. If any entry is marked with an asterisk, know the location of that entry before going anywhere. Okay, that was specific. Asterisked entries. The maintenance log, I figured, was probably just a record of broken lights or leaky faucets. 3. All log entries must be in your own handwriting. Do not type, print, or allow anyone else to fill in your entries. Now that was strange. Why handwriting? Seemed inefficient. Probably just a holdover from a previous system. 4. After 11 p.m., ride the elevator facing away from the doors. Do not turn around until the doors open at your floor. I snorted, a little laugh escaping me. Seriously? That was just silly. A prank, maybe? Some previous employee trying to scare the newbies? 5. After 11 p.m., never face the north wall while stationary. If you need to look, turn your whole body, do not hold the position. My eyebrows shot up. Okay, now someone was having a laugh. The north wall. What was I supposed to be seeing on the north wall? 6. Count the red dispatch folders at the start and end of every shift. If the numbers don't match, report immediately. Red dispatch folders. Of course, a completely arbitrary thing to count. 7. Do not volunteer for overtime on the last Friday of the month. If assigned, follow the extended protocol. That one didn't seem so odd. Probably something to do with payroll or scheduling. 8. Do not look up in the stairwell unless there is a specific work reason to do so. If you do look up, complete the task and look away. The stairwell. Right? I hadn't even noticed the stairwell yet. 9. Do not bring any items that are yellow onto the premises. This includes clothing, accessories, food packaging, or personal items. Yellow, that was weirdly restrictive. My wife, Tess, had a yellow scarf she always wore when she was feeling unwell. I'd have to remember to leave it in the car. 10. Do not make personal copies of any on-site documentation. Not photographs, not handwritten transcriptions, not digital scans. Information belongs to the premises. That felt less eccentric and more controlling. Still, it wasn't exactly a law. It was just a rule. I finished reading, folded the sheet, and tucked it into the employee handbook. Probably just some old-timers' quirks, written down and passed along. A bit much, but harmless. I glanced at the clock. 10:53 p.m. My shift was starting. I turned to the computer, logged in, and the screen flickered to life. The dispatcher software opened, displaying a list of trucks and their current locations. I took a deep breath, trying to focus. It was just a job. A steady job, with benefits. It was enough. For now. As I began to familiarize myself with the system, I noticed something. The fluorescent light above my cubicle was flickering, even more noticeably than the one outside, and the metallic dryness in the air seemed stronger. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. Probably just tired. The hospital bills, the worry about Tess, the long drive. It was all catching up to me. I reached for my coffee cup, finding it empty. I'd have to get a refill. And maybe, just maybe, avoid looking at the north wall, just in case. I was cataloging incoming manifests, scanning the paperwork, and entering the details into the system. Mostly produce runs this night. A lot of lettuce from California, some oranges from Florida. Tedious stuff, but it kept my hands busy and kept my mind from drifting too much. I preferred it to actually talking on the radio, coordinating with drivers. Those guys, they had stories. Usually involving bad coffee and worse motel rooms. I could handle the paperwork. The dispatcher software was ancient, a relic from the 90s, and it crashed every other hour. Tonight it was holding steady, which was a small victory. The fluorescent lights hummed, a constant, irritating drone. I'd gotten used to it, more or less. I'd started noticing the patterns in the flickering, too. Certain lights pulsed faster than others, almost like breathing. I immediately dismissed it. Lack of sleep. Too much caffeine earlier. I hadn't even finished the first pot of coffee yet, and already I was seeing things. Around 3:15 a.m., Una came by, needing a signature on a delivery confirmation. She worked the day shift usually, but was covering for someone who'd called in sick. She smelled faintly of cinnamon and something floral, a sharp contrast to the stale coffee and diesel that permeated the building. "Quiet night, huh?" she asked, her voice raspy. "So far," I said, signing the form with a quick scribble. "Nothing exciting." She chuckled. "Exciting's not usually what you want in this job, just reliable." She paused, looking around the empty room. "You still getting used to the rules?" I shrugged. "They're a lot, but I'm sure there's a reason for them." "Old man Hemlock," she said, shaking her head. "He ran this place for 40 years. He was particular. Everything had a system, a reason. Most of us just figured it out over time." She gave me a sympathetic look. "Don't worry about them too much. Just do what they say." She left, and I went back to the manifests. The lettuce was piling up. Time seemed to stretch and compress in odd ways during these overnight shifts. An hour could feel like 5 minutes, or 5 minutes like an hour. It was disorienting. Then I looked at the clock. 4:58 a.m. Almost time to wrap up. I'd cleared the backlog of manifests, updated the driver logs, and everything seemed to be in order. I glanced around the room. Empty. Except for me. I was the last one. I remembered the sheet of rules. The last one. Something about a ritual. I vaguely recalled it being about checking things. Lights, rooms, it felt hazy, indistinct. I fished the crumpled sheet out of my handbook, unfolded it, and scanned the text. Whoever leaves last must perform the following before exiting. Check every light switch. Say each room aloud. Walk the perimeter once. Do not leave without completing it. A wave of irritation washed over me. Seriously? This was just absurd. I was already behind on getting home. Tess needed me, and I was supposed to wander around an empty building, reciting room names like a child. It was a waste of time, a pointless exercise designed by some eccentric old man. I convinced myself it was for security, maybe to ensure the building was properly secured before being left unattended. A final check. I could do a quick version. I flipped every light switch I could see in the immediate area. The cubicles, the break room. I mumbled the names of the rooms as I passed them. Break room records dispatch, conference room. I skipped the perimeter walk. The building was huge. It would take 15 minutes at least. And what was the point? I hadn't seen anyone else all night. I locked up, set the alarm, and headed for my truck. I was already formulating a mental list of things to do when I got home. Things Tess would need. I told myself I'd do the perimeter walk tomorrow night. It wasn't like anything was going to happen. I was halfway home, merging onto the highway, when it hit me. The feeling wasn't a thought, more like a cold press against the back of my skull. I hadn't walked the perimeter, I'd skipped it. It was a specific instruction, and I'd ignored it. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a silly rule, a quirk of an old building. But the metallic taste was back in my mouth, stronger than before, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something. I shook my head, trying to clear the feeling. It was the exhaustion, that's all. But I knew, with a growing certainty, that I hadn't just skipped a step in a meaningless ritual. I'd left something unfinished. And now, whatever it was waiting. The coffee was awful. Even for gas station coffee, it tasted like someone had steeped a dirty sock in hot water. But it was hot, and it was keeping the sleep at bay. I'd pulled over to Uev's Quick Stop 10 minutes from the yard, figuring I could grab a refill before heading back in for the handover. It was just after 7. The sun was barely thinking about rising, and the parking lot was mostly empty except for a couple of long haulers nursing their own bad coffee. I always felt a little kinship with those guys, even if I wasn't actually on the road. We were all just passing through. I sat in the truck, watching the steam curl from the cardboard cup. The dispatch center felt colder than it had the night before, even with the heater running full blast. It wasn't a biting cold, just a pervasive chill that seemed to settle in your bones. I chalked it up to the damp November air. This time of year always felt like everything was slowly rotting. The leaves, the woodpiles, even the optimism. Back at the office. I found Nell already at her station, looking remarkably cheerful for 7 in the morning. She was sorting through a stack of delivery confirmations, her chipped nail polish glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Morning, Kieran," she said, without looking up. "Rough night?" "Just tired," I said. "Slow mostly. You?" "Same. Quiet as a tomb. Almost unsettling." She finally looked up, offering a small smile. "Hey, Mr. Henderson left the maintenance logs out for you. Said it's your responsibility to look over them before you start." I found the stack of faded blue folders on the counter. They smelled faintly of dust and something else, old paper and maybe oil. I started flipping through the most recent one, dated the week prior, mostly routine stuff, light bulb replacements, a faulty thermostat in the break room, a leaky faucet in the men's room, standard building maintenance. Then I saw it on page 3, an entry for the East Corridor, detailing a faulty electrical outlet. Next to the entry was a small hand-drawn circle around the entire line. It wasn't a highlight mark, not a standard flag. It was deliberate, almost insistent. I remembered the rules, or at least a fragment of one. Something about the logs, something about needing to know things. If something was marked, it came back to me in flashes, disjointed and unsettling. It wasn't about reading the logs, it was about being aware of what the logs contained. I frowned. It was probably just a way for the maintenance guy to flag things that hadn't been fixed yet. A reminder, but I was already standing up, grabbing my clipboard. I figured I'd walk down to the East Corridor, take a look at the outlet, just to be thorough. It was part of the job, wasn't it? Preventative maintenance. Better to catch something before it became a problem. As I walked down the hallway, the air grew noticeably colder. The fluorescent lights flickered, not dramatically, but with a subtle, uneven pulse. I dismissed it as old wiring. This building was falling apart after all. I reached the East Corridor, a long, narrow passage lined with storage rooms and offices that were rarely used. The outlet in question was halfway down, near the end of the hall. I was almost there when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic clicking sound coming from inside one of the storage rooms. It wasn't loud, barely audible over the hum of the building's ventilation system. But it was persistent. Click, click, click. My hand froze inches from the faulty outlet. I stopped walking. The clicking continued, steady and unsettling. It didn't sound like anything mechanical. It sounded organic, like something tapping its nails against a hard surface. I didn't think, I just turned my attention to the storage room, and then back to the outlet, the maintenance log, the circled entry, the rule. It wasn't about fixing the outlet, it was about knowing about the outlet, about knowing what was near it. I walked past the outlet, heading back the way I came. I didn't inspect it. I didn't touch it. I didn't even look at it again. The clicking continued, fading slightly as I moved away. It wasn't a feeling of fear that I felt, not exactly. It was a tightening in my chest, a sense of something wrong, profoundly, fundamentally wrong. I made a note on my clipboard, East Corridor outlet flagged uninspected. I didn't write why. I just knew I couldn't add anything more. When I got back to my station, Nell was gone. The room was silent, the only sound the low hum of the computers. I felt a strange compulsion to look at the maintenance log again, to see if there were other circled entries. But I didn't. Not yet. I just sat down and started sorting the new manifests, trying to focus on the mundane details of routing and scheduling, trying to ignore the lingering click in the back of my mind. And the cold. It hadn't gone away. It had, if anything, gotten worse. I was compiling the overnight delivery estimates, cross-referencing the manifests with the driver availability. It was a tedious job, mostly just transferring numbers from one spreadsheet to another, but it was quiet work. The kind of work that let you think, or more often, not think. I was trying not to think about the bills piling up on the kitchen counter, about the way my wife, Vera, had been quieter than usual on the phone earlier. Just numbers, just routes, just getting the trucks moving. The dispatch center, even at 3 in the morning, had a peculiar smell. Not unpleasant exactly, but layered. Old coffee, stale cigarettes, a faint lingering sweetness like industrial cleaner trying to mask something else. I'd gotten used to it, I supposed. It was just the smell of work. The heating unit kicked on with a groan, blasting lukewarm air, and I adjusted the vent to direct it away from my station. The cold hadn't really lifted. I was working on a particularly complicated route, a multi-drop shipment heading up to Maine, when I noticed it. A handwritten note tucked into the section for driver reports. My section. It wasn't a report, not exactly. Just a single line, scrawled in blue ink. Check the rear loading dock, Unit 3. My brow furrowed. I hadn't written that. I distinctly remembered clearing that section when I'd finished processing the midday deliveries. I used a black pen, always. And my handwriting, well, it wasn't particularly neat, but it was definitely more angular. This was rounder, softer, almost familiar, but not. It was probably just Nell. She sometimes helped out with the overnight paperwork, occasionally taking a run to the break room for coffee, and then scribbling down a quick note to a driver if something came up. She had a habit of using blue pens. It was a simple explanation, the most likely explanation. I glanced at the clock. She hadn't been back since she'd left to use the restroom nearly an hour ago. Still, it could have been her. I reached for the maintenance log, flipping through the pages, just to double-check if there had been a reported issue with Unit 3. Something that might require a check. Nothing. No circled entries, no notes about the loading dock. A vague unease settled over me. I remembered the rule, or at least the feeling of the rule. Something about recording things yourself, about keeping things authentic. It wasn't a precise memory, more a general sense of caution. All entries must be your own handwriting. Don't let anyone else fill them in. I grabbed a fresh sheet of paper from the pad on my desk, uncapped my pen, and wrote in clear, deliberate letters. Note received regarding Unit 3 loading dock. No issues observed. I carefully dated it, initialed it, and tucked it into the driver report section directly beneath the other note, covering it. I didn't go to the rear loading dock. I didn't want to know what Unit 3 contained. The thought of walking back there, into the darkness, searching for something I hadn't been asked to find, it felt wrong, proactively wrong. It was a strange aversion, a gut feeling that told me to stay put, to avoid that particular part of the building. I returned to the main route, forcing myself to concentrate on the numbers, on the mileage, on the estimated delivery times. The cold seemed to have intensified, clinging to the back of my neck. The quiet felt heavier now, not peaceful, but expectant. I kept glancing at the doorway leading to the rear loading dock. It was just a dark rectangle, a void in the wall. And I hadn't gone near it. I wouldn't. I felt a peculiar dryness in my mouth. I hadn't realized I'd stopped breathing properly. My hand instinctively went to my pen, tightening my grip. I would need to be meticulous. Every entry, every log. My handwriting, only mine. I was reconciling the fuel receipts, matching the numbers from the driver logs to the credit card statements. It wasn't exciting work, but it was predictable. Each driver had a set allowance, and discrepancies, usually a few gallons here or there, were common. Most were honest mistakes, rounding errors, misremembered pump numbers. Occasionally, though, someone would try to sneak in a little extra for themselves. I flagged those for Vaughn to deal with in the morning. He'd handle the personnel side of things. I just needed to make sure the book's balanced. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a constant low thrum that usually faded into background noise. Tonight, though, it felt particularly insistent, like a trapped insect buzzing just beyond my perception. I rubbed my eyes, blaming it on the late hour and the endless columns of numbers. I'd been staring at the screen for almost 3 hours, and my vision was starting to swim. I reached for my coffee cup, finding it lukewarm and bitter. I should have made a fresh pot an hour ago, but I'd been trying to push through the backlog before taking another break. The thought of getting up, walking to the break room, and dealing with the sputtering coffee machine felt exhausting. I took a small sip anyway, grimacing. It was then I heard it. The elevator. The dispatch center was on the 3rd floor of a low-rise office building. The elevator was primarily used for deliveries and for bringing up supplies. We rarely used it for routine office traffic, especially not at 2:17 a.m. I hadn't scheduled any deliveries for this hour, and the supply order wouldn't arrive until tomorrow afternoon. The doors chimed open on the 2nd floor. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe a cleaning crew had been scheduled, or a security guard making their rounds. But then the elevator started moving again, ascending. I glanced at the clock again. 2:18 a.m. Still no reason for anyone to be using the elevator. And it was moving awfully quickly. It felt eager. That's when I remembered. A flicker of something I'd read, buried in the stack of company policies I'd been forced to review during my onboarding. Something about the elevator. After 2 a.m., facing away, a coldness spread across my chest. It wasn't a clear memory, more a sense of procedure. A very specific procedure. Don't face the doors. Don't look. It was ridiculous, of course. Just another one of those arbitrary rules designed to keep people on their toes, to ensure compliance. Probably some old safety regulation nobody understood anymore. A way to make sure people weren't fiddling with the controls or something. I pushed the thought aside. It was the middle of the night. I was tired, and my imagination was running wild. But the elevator was approaching. I could hear the faint whir of the motor growing louder. It was almost directly outside my door. I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor. It was a small sound, but it felt deafening in the silence. I turned my back to the elevator, my spine pressed against the cool wall. I focused on the fuel receipts on my desk, willing my hands to remain steady as I started sorting through the next stack. It was all perfectly logical. A late-night maintenance check, a forgotten package, some perfectly reasonable explanation. I didn't need to look. I didn't want to look. The elevator doors chimed open right behind me. A soft, almost hesitant chime. I could feel the rush of air as the doors parted, a subtle change in pressure against my neck. I kept my gaze fixed on the receipts, my fingers trembling slightly as I separated the paper clips. Then, a sound. Not a mechanical sound, not the whir of the elevator or the chime of the doors. It was a rustling, like fabric shifting or paper crinkling. It was close, very close. I squeezed my eyes shut, my knuckles white. I hadn't moved. I hadn't turned around. I'd followed the rule. The rustling stopped, a beat of silence, then a scent. Not unpleasant, not exactly. It was dusty, old paper, and something else, something I couldn't quite place, like dried flowers, but wrong, overripe. The doors chimed again, a longer, more drawn-out chime this time, as if reluctant to close. And then they began to descend, slowly. I didn't open my eyes until I heard the elevator reach the first floor and stop. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't expectant. It was empty, hollow. I finally turned around. The elevator was gone. The hallway was exactly as it had been before, bathed in the pale, flickering light of the emergency exit sign. But something had changed. On the floor, directly in front of my door, lay a single dried rose petal, a deep, almost black crimson. It hadn't been there before. I hadn't noticed it. I hadn't seen it fall. It just was. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. I carefully backed away, returning to my desk. The fuel receipts blurred before my eyes. The numbers swam. I reached for my coffee, but my hand wouldn't cooperate. It felt leaden, useless. I needed to finish the reconciliation. I needed to focus. I needed to pretend this hadn't happened. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I wouldn't be able to. I'd followed the rule. I hadn't looked. And yet something had still come through. Something I didn't understand. Something I couldn't explain. And now there was a petal. A single black rose petal. And the smell lingered. The overnight reports were lighter than usual, mostly long hauls, predictable routes. A few new drivers, paperwork a mess as always. I was sorting through a stack of delivery confirmations, cross-referencing them with the digital logs, trying to catch any discrepancies. It was tedious, but it paid the bills. Or at least it slowed down the rate at which we were losing everything. The chipped formica of the desk felt cool under my forearms. I'd wiped it down earlier, trying to get rid of the coffee rings and the general grime that seemed to accumulate regardless. The smell of industrial cleaner still hung in the air, a thin chemical scent battling with the stale odor of diesel and lukewarm coffee. I'd switched to tea. It settled my stomach better. I was trying to remember if I'd called Una about the specialist appointment for Leo. He'd been complaining about his knee again, and I needed to schedule something before it got worse. I'd meant to do it yesterday, but the dispatch had been a nightmare. 2 drivers called out sick, a major accident on Interstate 80, and a whole lot of yelling from Mr. Henderson over the phone. My head still ached from it. I glanced up, needing a break from the numbers. The north wall. That's where the old whiteboard was, the one they'd promised to replace for months. It was covered in faded marker streaks and half-erased schedules. I hadn't consciously looked at it, but I was looking at it now. And I didn't remember turning my head. It wasn't a dramatic realization, not at first, just a small glitch in my awareness. Like waking up from a brief daydream. I'd been focused on the reports, and then suddenly, my gaze was fixed on the whiteboard. My neck wasn't stiff, didn't ache, no muscle memory of the turn. I hadn't intended to look. I dismissed it. Static cling. Just tired. I'd been staring at the same documents for hours. My eyes were probably wandering. I blinked, forcing myself to refocus on the delivery confirmations. But the image of the whiteboard, the smudged dates, and the faded route numbers stayed imprinted on my mind. Then I remembered. Something about not facing that wall. A fragment of something I'd read in the log. The reports. It wasn't specific. Just a feeling, a sense that there was a restriction after a certain hour, and it was about facing that direction. The north wall. I told myself it was ridiculous. I was exhausted, stressed, and probably coming down with a cold. This whole place was getting to me. The quiet, the isolation, the constant pressure to keep everything moving. It was playing tricks on my mind. But the memory, that half-formed rule, wouldn't let go. And the fact that I couldn't recall turning my head, that my body hadn't registered the movement, was deeply unsettling. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd shifted slowly, subconsciously, without realizing it. Maybe my peripheral vision had caught something on the wall and my eyes had followed. I needed to check the fuel levels for the eastern runs. The tank reader was acting up, and I wanted to get a manual reading before the morning shift arrived. The fuel shed was just outside the back door, facing away from the north wall. That's what I needed to do. But to get to the door, I had to turn. And turning meant briefly facing the north wall again. I hesitated. I didn't want to, but the fuel levels were critical. If the trucks went out with inaccurate readings, it could cause major delays, potential fines. Mr. Henderson would have my hide. I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum. I considered walking backwards, trying to avoid looking at the wall, but the space was too cramped. I'd likely bump into something, knock something over. It would be more awkward, draw more attention. I closed my eyes. I told myself it was fine. It was just a feeling, a silly superstition. I took a deep breath, and then quickly, I pivoted on my heel, keeping my gaze fixed on the floor. I didn't look at the wall. I didn't allow myself to even glance in that direction. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, a tightening sensation, like something was pushing against me, trying to force me to look. I kept my eyes down, focusing on the worn patches of the linoleum. I reached the door, fumbled with the handle, and stepped outside. The air was colder than I expected, carrying the scent of diesel and damp concrete. The fuel shed was only a few yards away. But as I started walking, I noticed something. The small metal lockbox where we kept the manual fuel gauge was wide open. It hadn't been opened before. I distinctly remember locking it yesterday after taking the previous reading. And inside, the gauge was missing. Gone. I stopped, a cold dread creeping up my spine. The fuel levels. The eastern runs. Mr. Henderson. It wasn't just a silly superstition, it was something else, and I'd already broken the rule. I was sorting the incoming manifests, stacking them neatly by route number. It was a mindless task, something I could do on autopilot while I drank my coffee. The coffee was lukewarm, tasted faintly of the metal carafe, but it was still better than nothing. 3:30 a.m., quietest part of the night. Even the hum of the refrigerators in the break room seemed muted. Una was supposed to come in at 5 to relieve me. I'd already started mentally listing everything I needed to tell her. The issue with Truck 42's left brake light, the discrepancy in the fuel surcharge for the Henderson run last week, and the fact that Old Man Hemlock had called again, complaining about his load being late. Hemlock was always complaining. I finished the manifests, then started tackling the supply closet. Mr. Henderson had been on me about inventory for weeks. He said we were bleeding money on lost pens, extra shipping labels, and disappearing highlighters. Honestly, it felt like a waste of my time, like he was focusing on pennies while the roof was leaking. But I needed this job, more than I liked to admit. The supply closet was a disaster. Boxes overflowing with cardboard, stacks of outdated forms, a jumble of safety vests. I started systematically going through everything, making a list on a scratch pad. Pens, 47, staplers, 3, 2 functional, highlighters, 12, mostly dried out, shipping labels, 2 rolls, safety vests, 18, all sizes. Then I got to the reflective triangles. Those bright orange warning triangles the drivers have to put out when they're stopped on the side of the road. We were supposed to have 20. I counted. 1, 2, 3, 17, 17. My stomach did a little flip. 17, that was off. I counted again, more carefully, spreading them out on the floor. 17. Definitely 17. It was probably just a mistake. Someone miscounted last time. Or maybe a driver took an extra one and forgot to log it. It happened. People were careless. Mr. Henderson just created problems where none existed. I almost convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. Just a few missing triangles. But then I remembered the small typed note I'd found taped to the inside of the driver's report binder, the one with the handwriting that wasn't mine, and the circled date in the maintenance log, and the fuel gauge, and the rose petal. And the way I'd felt when I'd looked at the north wall. Everything felt connected now, like strands of a spiderweb tightening around me. I recalled something from the stack of company policies I'd been forced to read during orientation, something about inventory, something about counts. There was a section buried in with the safety regulations and the HR guidelines about checking specific items at the start and end of your shift. Reflective triangles were on the list. It said something about reporting discrepancies immediately. If the numbers didn't match, report it. I didn't want to report it. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I didn't want Mr. Henderson breathing down my neck, asking questions I couldn't answer. But the thought of ignoring it, of pretending everything was fine, felt worse. Like ignoring a leak in the roof, hoping it wouldn't spread. I walked over to the phone, my hand hovering over the receiver. I glanced at the clock. 3:45. Still an hour and 15 minutes before Una arrived. Plenty of time to explain it all. To say it was probably just a simple mistake. I dialed Mr. Henderson's extension. It rang 4 times before he picked up, his voice gruff with sleep. "Henderson," he barked. "Mr. Henderson, it's Kieran. Just wanted to let you know there's a discrepancy with the inventory." "A discrepancy?" He sounded instantly alert. What kind of discrepancy? "The reflective triangles. We're short 3. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him shifting in his chair. The rustle of papers. "Short 3? He finally said, his voice dangerously calm. "Are you sure?" "I counted them twice, sir. 17? We're supposed to have 20. "All right," he said slowly. "Don't touch anything. Don't move a single thing in that supply closet. I'm coming in." "Sir?" "Now." He hung up. I lowered the phone, my hand numb. I leaned against the counter trying to catch my breath. I'd done the right thing, hadn't I? Followed the rules. Reported the discrepancy. It was just a few missing triangles. It had to be. I looked back at the supply closet. The open boxes, the scattered forms, the 17 reflective triangles lying on the floor. And then I noticed something new. Tucked between 2 boxes of shipping labels, partially hidden in the shadows, was a single black rose petal, exactly like the one I'd found near the elevator. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know why it was there, but a cold, creeping dread settled over me, heavier than anything I'd felt before. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this wasn't about missing triangles. This was about something else entirely. I grabbed my coffee mug, the lukewarm liquid sloshing over the rim. It smelled acrid metallic like old pennies. I set it down, untouched, and started making another inventory list, this time for everything else in the supply closet. It felt like a pointless exercise, but I couldn't seem to stop. I needed to know what else was missing. I needed to know what else had changed. I was relabeling the driver manifests. It wasn't urgent, not exactly, just something to do. The manifests were a mess, mostly because of Una. She was a good driver, reliable, but her handwriting looked like a spider had walked through ink and then tap danced across the forms. It took longer to decipher her logs than to actually process them. I smoothed out a particularly bad one, trying to make out the mileage. The paper felt thin, brittle, like it would crumble if I squeezed too hard. The dispatch center was quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of things holding their breath. The fluorescent lights hummed, a low thrum that vibrated in my teeth. I'd gotten used to it mostly, though lately I noticed it more. Or maybe I was just noticing more everything. Since the triangles, since the rose petals, it was probably just stress. The medical bills were still piling up, and I'd gotten a notice from the bank about the mortgage. Another late payment. I finished with Una's manifest and stacked it with the others, then started on Petra's. Hers were neat, precise, almost clinical. I preferred Petra's manifests, less work. I glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. Another slow night. I'd almost finished the relabeling and could then get to the pre-trip inspection reports. I really needed to start on those. Mr. Henderson had been breathing down my neck about them all week. Then the dispatcher line rang. It was Vera, asking if anyone was available for an overtime run. A load of refrigerated goods needed to get to Harrisburg before sunrise. She sounded tired, her voice raspy. "Just one driver short," she said. "A big bonus for whoever takes it. And honestly, Kieran, we're really in a bind. I hesitated. I hadn't planned on overtime. I needed to be home to check on my wife, make sure she'd slept all right. But the bonus would cover the late fee on the mortgage, and then some. It would at least buy us a little breathing room. I thought about the hives in the backyard, needing a check for varroa mites before winter. Maybe, just maybe, this could fix a few things. I can do it, I said, before I even fully processed the words. Oh, thank God, Vera said, relief flooding her voice. You're a lifesaver. It's a straight shot, easy miles. Just gotta sign the paperwork and get rolling. The shift starts now, technically. We needed someone on the road by midnight. I hung up the phone and felt a prickle of unease. Midnight, that was close. I checked the calendar tacked to the wall, Friday, the 27th. And then I remembered something, a flicker of a warning in the back of my mind. Something about certain dates. I strained to recall it. A half-formed thought struggling to surface. Something about not volunteering for overtime on specific nights. It felt connected to the maintenance logs, to the weirdness that had started creeping into the dispatch center. It was just a feeling, though, a vague sense of caution. Probably just me being paranoid. Vera was desperate. It was a good bonus. My wife needed the best care. I needed to keep the house. I needed to stop overthinking things. I walked over to the sign-out sheet, the fluorescent lights flickering above my head. The sheet was mostly blank, except for Nell's signature from earlier in the evening. As I reached for the pen, I smelled it. Not like anything burning, not exactly, more like static. Like the air after a thunderstorm, but metallic and sharp. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I paused, my hand hovering over the sheet. The smell intensified, and for a moment, the humming of the lights seemed to change pitch, becoming higher, more insistent. I glanced around the room, trying to pinpoint the source. Nothing. Everything looked normal. The clock ticked. 11:58 p.m. Then, I saw it, or rather didn't see it. The small digital clock on the coffee machine, the one I used to time my breaks, was gone. Just a blank space on the counter where it had been moments before. I blinked, thinking I was imagining things, but the space remained empty. I snatched my hand back from the sign-out sheet. The bonus, the mortgage, the hives, it all faded into the background. Whatever that rule was, that half-remembered warning, it was real, and I'd almost ignored it. I stepped back from the desk, a wave of nausea washing over me. I didn't sign anything. I didn't take the run. I called Vera back, mumbled something about a family emergency, and hung up before she could argue. The relief was immediate, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hollow fear. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that I'd gotten away with something, and that whatever I'd avoided was still out there, waiting. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking, not exactly. They felt heavy, weighted, like I'd been holding stones. I walked to the window and stared out at the empty parking lot, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I needed to tell my wife, not about the overtime, not about the clock, just that I was coming home, and that I needed her to be awake. The manifest for the 3:15 out of Shreveport was a mess. Usually, Una handles the Louisiana runs. She knows all the quirks of those drivers, but she called in sick with something that sounded like a bad cold, so it fell to me. 15 different stops, a mix of palletized auto parts and refrigerated goods. It meant cross-referencing the bill of lading with the weight tickets, making sure everything matched, and then building the route in the nav system. Tedious but necessary, and quiet. I liked the quiet. After the near thing with the overtime, the feeling of being watched hadn't entirely faded, but it had receded enough that I could focus. I'd brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The smell was a welcome distraction, and I was methodically entering each stop into the system. The fluorescent lights hummed, a steady drone that usually faded into the background. I'd even managed to ignore the empty space on the counter where the clock used to be. It was just a clock. Vera would get me another one. A digital one. A louder one, maybe. The dispatch center was built around a central atrium, 2 stories high. It wasn't exactly grand, more like a large utilitarian space with a metal staircase leading to the storage loft above. The loft was mostly filled with old records, outdated maps, and spare office supplies. I hadn't been up there in months. I didn't have a reason to. The air circulation wasn't great up there. It always felt stuffy and close. I was confirming the weight of a shipment of brake rotors when I heard it. A scraping sound, high up, like something dragging across metal. It was faint, almost lost in the hum of the lights and the distant rumble of trucks coming and going. I paused, pen hovering over the manifest. Probably just the wind, I thought, or maybe something settling in the loft. Old building after all. The metal frame expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. The sound came again, louder this time. Definitely not the wind. It was deliberate, a rhythmic scrape, then a pause, then another scrape, longer, more insistent. It felt like something was moving around up there, deliberately making noise. My knuckles felt tight, and I noticed a tremor running through my left hand. Not shaking, not exactly. More like a buzzing sensation, a low-frequency vibration. And then I remembered, not a clear recollection, not a perfectly formed rule, but a feeling. A fragment of something I'd read. Something about looking up, about avoiding looking upwards in certain places. The loft. The atrium. A specific prohibition. I couldn't grasp the details, couldn't remember the exact wording, but the instinct was overwhelming. Don't look up. I tried to dismiss it, just my nerves. I told myself, the stress of everything with my wife, the weirdness of the last few weeks, I needed to focus on the manifest, on getting this driver on the road. But the scraping continued, drawing my gaze upwards, despite my best efforts. It wasn't a rational fear, it wasn't a fear of falling debris or a hidden intruder, it was a deeper, more primal sense of wrongness. Like something was actively trying to attract my attention, and the longer I ignored it, the more insistent it became. I had a shipment list to finish, a route to build. I had to keep my head down. But the scraping, it had changed. Now it was accompanied by a clicking sound, like claws on metal, and it was directly above my workstation. I was halfway through entering the final delivery address when I felt it. A cold spot on the back of my neck. The buzzing in my hand intensified. I knew, without looking, that something was waiting. I didn't finish the manifest. I didn't double-check the weight tickets. I didn't even look at the nav system. I simply grabbed the completed paperwork, shoved it into the driver's slot, and stepped away from my station, backwards, without looking up. I walked quickly, almost mechanically, to the break room, needing to put distance between myself and whatever was making that noise. The break room lights were dim, a welcome relief from the harsh fluorescent glare of the dispatch area. I leaned against the counter, trying to slow my breathing, trying to ignore the throbbing in my temples. I hadn't seen anything, I hadn't confirmed anything, and that somehow was the worst part. I hadn't allowed myself to see what was causing the noise. I stayed there for a long time, just leaning against the counter, listening. The scraping and clicking had stopped. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. It didn't feel like relief, it felt like anticipation. Like the absence of sound was a signal. When I finally went back to my workstation, the manifest was still in the driver's slot. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. On my desk, neatly placed beside my phone, was a small dried leaf. Not a rose petal this time, but a maple leaf. Perfectly preserved and unnaturally black. I didn't touch it, I didn't need to. I knew with a growing dread that whatever had been up there was still paying attention, and that it had left me a message. The manifest for Old Man Hemlock was a mess. Always was. He ran a small, independent hauling operation, mostly farm supplies and livestock feed, and his paperwork looked like it had been written on the back of a napkin during a dust storm. I was methodically correcting his handwritten entries, transferring the information to the digital system, when I noticed the mug. It was my travel mug, the one my daughter Maisie had painted for me last year. A bright, cheerful yellow with bumblebees all over it. I'd been using it every night, filling it with lukewarm coffee from the break room's ancient machine. It felt normal having it there. A small piece of home in this sterile concrete box. I took a sip. The coffee was particularly bad tonight, burnt and weak, but the warmth was comforting. Then, a flicker. A memory, not of the rules exactly, but of something I'd skimmed over in that ridiculous document Mr. Henderson had given me. something about colors. Not specific colors, but an aversion to bringing in certain hues. I couldn't recall the exact wording, couldn't even remember which page it was on, but the impression was vivid. A warning, a prohibition, and yellow felt wrong. Honestly, it was absurd. A mug. A yellow mug. It was probably just my imagination running wild, fueled by sleep deprivation and the general creepiness of this place. I'd been pushing myself too hard, worrying about the mortgage, about Una's appointments, about everything. I needed to stop fixating on every little thing. It was just a mug, a silly bumblebee-covered mug. I finished my coffee, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being ridiculous. But then I glanced at the maintenance log. It wasn't the circled entry this time. It was just open, lying flat on the counter as though someone had been reading it, and the air felt colder near my station. I hadn't left it open. I distinctly remembered closing it after checking the outlet report, and the cold wasn't the usual draft from the poorly sealed windows. It was localized, focused, like a pocket of winter clinging to the metal frame of the desk. I didn't think. I didn't analyze. I just reacted. I grabbed the mug, the yellow ceramic cool against my palm, and shoved it into my backpack, burying it under my lunch bag and a worn copy of Beekeeping for Dummies. It felt better. Not good, not relieved, but less exposed. The cold spot hadn't disappeared, but it hadn't intensified either. It just remained, a constant, unsettling presence. I returned to Hemlock's manifest, forcing myself to focus on the numbers and the addresses. The clicking sound from the loft hadn't returned, but I found myself instinctively avoiding looking up. Old habits, I supposed. The night wore on, punctuated by the static hiss of the radio and the occasional rumble of a truck pulling into the yard. I dispatched a load of lumber to Petra, a new driver with a surprisingly calm voice, and a shipment of fertilizer to Uwe, who grumbled about the weather. Each dispatch felt different, like I was performing a ritual, carefully adhering to a set of unspoken rules. Around 3 a.m., I needed to check the fuel levels for the morning run. I walked towards the monitoring station, careful to keep my back to the elevator, a habit I hadn't even realized I'd adopted. The usual hum of the machinery felt off, thinner somehow, and the fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The fuel gauge read 78%, which was impossible. It had been at 85% when I'd last checked. I double-checked the readings, cycling through the different tanks, but the numbers remained stubbornly low. It wasn't a massive discrepancy, but it was enough to raise an eyebrow, enough to trigger the inventory protocol. As I was logging the discrepancy, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A movement, near the north wall. I didn't look directly at it, remembering the feeling, the dread that had washed over me when I'd broken that rule. But I saw it nonetheless. A shifting distortion in the concrete, like heat rising off asphalt. It wasn't a reflection, not a trick of the light. It was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. It lasted only a moment, a fleeting glimpse of something indistinct and unsettling. Then it was gone. The wall returned to its normal, drab gray. I blinked, wondering if I'd imagined it, wondering if I was finally losing my mind. I finished logging the fuel discrepancy, my hand trembling slightly. The cold spot near my desk had intensified, now radiating a chill that penetrated my jacket. I felt watched, not by a person, not by a camera, but by something ancient and unseen. I glanced down at my backpack, feeling the reassuring weight of the yellow mug inside. It hadn't protected me. It hadn't prevented what I'd seen. It had only changed the focus, the direction of the attention, and that realization, more than anything else, filled me with a bone-deep dread. The shift wasn't over. It had just begun, and I had a feeling it was going to be a long night. I was reconciling the fuel tax reports, a task I genuinely didn't mind. It was methodical, a puzzle of numbers that, once solved, felt contained. Unlike the rest of this job, unlike everything else lately. The reports were printed on that awful, almost peach-colored paper, the kind that always smelled faintly of whatever cleaning solution Una used on the counters. I'd stacked them neatly, chronologically, and was working my way through, verifying mileage against dispatch records. The radio was quiet for a stretch, just the low hiss and crackle of static. Usually there was someone calling in, needing a route adjusted, a load reweighted, a complaint about a diner's coffee. But for 20 minutes, nothing. It was nice. I even managed to ignore the cold spot for a little while. It was still there, of course, radiating from the corner of my desk, but it felt a little less insistent, a little less like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I glanced at the clock. It was 4:17 a.m. 5 hours remained. I'd promised Sarah I'd check on the hives when I got home. The late bloom was supposed to be good this year, and I hadn't had a chance to inspect them properly in over a week. Just a quick peek to make sure they hadn't swarmed. That was all. I was starting to feel the ache of missing them, the quiet hum of the boxes, the warm scent of wax and honey. That's when I remembered the list. All the rules, not rules like traffic laws, but these other things, the ones I'd scribbled down on the back of an old dispatch form trying to make sense of the madness. The ones that felt less like guidelines and more like constraints. I needed to remember them, not just vaguely recall the gist, but have them solid in my head. I needed to know what I was dealing with. I reached for my phone, intending to photograph the sheet I'd taped to the inside of my locker, a digital backup, just in case. The image would be easier to review, to memorize, than the cramped handwriting on the faded paper. I propped the phone against my coffee mug, framed the shot, and pressed the button. Halfway through the process, a prickling sensation started at the back of my neck. It wasn't the cold spot, it was different. Sharper, more focused, like being watched but not in a threatening way, more observed. I paused, lowering the phone slightly. It was probably nothing, just fatigue. The late hour. Too much coffee. I was letting this whole thing get to me. I was a dispatcher, not a paranormal investigator. It was a job, a paycheck, a way to keep a roof over our heads. But the feeling intensified. A subtle pressure in my sinuses, a tightness in my chest, and then I remembered a fragment, a blurry impression of a rule. Something about documentation, about not taking things from here. Information belonged to the premises, something about copies, about doors. It wasn't clear, not precise, but it was enough. I lowered the phone completely. I stared at the half-finished photograph on the screen, the image of the scribbled notes, the circled words. I hesitated for a second, my thumb hovering over the delete button. It was just a picture, right? A digital image. Harmless. But the pressure in my chest had become more pronounced, a dull ache that spread to my shoulder. I deleted the photo. Immediately, the pressure eased. The prickling sensation subsided. It felt better, quieter. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. See? Just nerves, just exhaustion. I was making mountains out of molehills. Then I noticed the smell. It wasn't the usual smell of stale coffee and diesel fumes. It was something else. Something sweet, cloying and faintly metallic, like overripe fruit mixed with iron. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but it grew stronger, filling the small dispatch office, clinging to the back of my throat. It smelled like the inside of a rusted can. I looked around, trying to pinpoint the source. Nothing. The air vents were clean, no spilled liquid, no obvious explanation. And then I noticed it, the fuel tax report for Hemlock Transport. The one I'd been working on, the one I'd just finished reconciling. It was gone, vanished, completely disappeared from the neat stack on my desk. I frantically searched, rifling through the other reports, checking under the desk, even looking on the floor. Nothing. It had simply ceased to exist. That particular report, with all its meticulously verified numbers, its neat columns and precise calculations, was gone, and with it, the confirmation I needed to finalize the monthly fuel tax filing. The report that was due to corporate in less than 12 hours. I sat back in my chair, a cold dread settling over me. It wasn't about the rules, not anymore. It wasn't about strange sounds or flickering lights. It was about things disappearing, things I needed, and I had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. Sarah's insurance renewal was riding on this month's numbers being accurate, and it was gone. Because I'd tried to take a picture. The smell lingered even after I'd clocked out, even after I'd driven 20 minutes home. It wasn't as strong, not in the cab of the truck, with the windows down and the heater blasting. But it was there, a phantom sweetness clinging to the inside of my nostrils. I told myself it was the air freshener, the cheap pine scent I'd grabbed at the last truck stop, trying to cover something up with something worse. It made a kind of sense. I pulled into the driveway, the headlights sweeping across the overgrown lawn. Sarah hadn't been able to keep up with it this year. The MS was getting worse. Each flare-up took more out of her, left her weaker, more tired. I killed the engine. The sudden silence amplified the chirping of the crickets. I hadn't noticed how loud they were lately, or maybe I hadn't been listening. The house was dark and quiet. I unlocked the door, the click echoing in the stillness. "Honey, I'm home." I called out, my voice sounding strangely loud. "In here," she replied, her voice muffled. I found her in the living room, wrapped in a quilt, watching some old movie on the television. The volume was low. She smiled when she saw me, a tired, sweet smile. "How was your night?" she asked. "Long," I said, and that felt like the understatement of the year. Quiet, mostly. Just the usual. I didn't mention the smell or the missing report. What was the point? It wouldn't make any sense. I wouldn't be able to explain it. I went into the kitchen, started a pot of coffee. The familiar smell of brewing coffee was comforting and grounding. It almost masked the other scent, the one that seemed to be permanently etched into my memory now, almost. I checked the mail. Bills mostly. Nothing urgent. I made a note to call the insurance company tomorrow. The renewal was looming, and I still hadn't gotten a clear answer on what their coverage would be. I needed that fuel tax report. I found myself double-checking the locks on the back door, even though I'd checked them before leaving this morning. And again, before I went to bed last night. It wasn't a conscious decision. My hand just moved, reaching for the bolt, sliding it into place. I did it again, just to be sure. Everything felt off-kilter, like I was constantly bracing for something. I hadn't been sleeping well. I kept waking up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, listening for sounds I couldn't identify. When I did wake, I'd automatically check the position of the furniture in the room. Just a quick glance to make sure nothing had moved. I went out to the backyard needing some air. The beehives were silent in the darkness. I shone a flashlight on them, checking for any signs of disturbance. The bees were still alive. That was something, at least. I noticed I couldn't bring myself to look up at the loft window. I hadn't realized I'd stopped doing that. I used to stand out here, sometimes just looking up at the stars, lost in thought. Now, even the thought of looking up there made my skin crawl. I found myself scanning the perimeter of the yard instead, fixing on the spaces between the trees, the shadows cast by the bushes. I went back inside, sat down next to Sarah on the couch. She leaned her head on my shoulder. I put my arm around her, trying to feel normal, trying to forget the past few weeks, trying to forget the smell. I looked at the TV, the flickering images reflecting in her eyes. It was a black and white film, something about a detective and a missing person. I couldn't concentrate on the plot. My gaze kept drifting to the corners of the room, to the spaces under the furniture, searching for. I didn't even know what I was searching for. I was counting the floor tiles, mentally cataloging the patterns in the wallpaper. The house felt smaller now, constricted, like the walls were closing in. I shifted in my seat, adjusting my position, trying to find a comfortable angle. But there wasn't one. There never would be. I glanced at the room and noticed the yellow ceramic mug sitting on the coffee table. I hadn't brought it to work today. Sarah must have moved it. It didn't belong there. It never did. It made the room feel wrong. I reached for it, intending to put it away, but stopped. I just sat there, staring at it. It was just a mug, but I couldn't touch it. Not yet. Not without feeling that same familiar prickle on the back of my neck. I leaned my head back against the couch, closed my eyes. I wished I could just sleep. But I knew I wouldn't. Not really. I'd be listening. Always listening. And I knew with a cold certainty that someone else would be taking that shift next week. Someone else would be finding those notes. Someone else would be smelling the sweetness.